The director, realizing the take was collapsing, did something completely unorthodox. He stepped in, literally, and tickled her feet. Julia Roberts wasn't prepared for it. Her laughter exploded, sharp, breathless, uncontrollable. She folded in on herself, momentarily unable to stay in character. Richard Gere, caught off guard, broke just enough to smile, but not enough to ruin the shot. The camera kept rolling. What audiences have been watching for decades is not a performance carefully crafted to charm them. It's a human reaction. Messy, spontaneous, and real. Why does that matter? Because in a film that increasingly leaned toward fantasy, that moment pierced the illusion. It reminded viewers that Vivian wasn't just a symbol or a role. She was a person. A woman capable of joy without permission. A woman laughing in a space where she had previously been judged, priced, and dismissed. And audiences felt it. Isn't it curious how one unscripted second can do more emotional work than an entire page of dialogue? That laugh didn't just humanize Vivian. It softened Edward. It disarmed the audience. It created intimacy without explanation. And in a story walking a tightrope between exploitation and empowerment, that mattered more than any line ever could. The illusion of choice. Pretty Woman asks an uncomfortable question, but then quickly covers it with charm. How much choice does Vivian really have? The film insists she is in control. She negotiates her rate. She sets boundaries. She refuses to be kissed on the mouth. She insists on honesty. These details matter, because they reassure the audience that Vivian is not a victim. But are those signs of freedom, or adaptations to constraint? Edward's world is defined by excess. Private jets. Penthouse suites. Boardrooms where decisions erase thousands of lives with a signature. Vivian's world, by contrast, is defined by survival. Streets. Clocks. Men who feel entitled to her body and her silence. When these worlds collide, the film frames it as romance. But beneath that framing lies a deeper tension. Is love still love when one person controls all the exits? The movie avoids answering directly. Instead, it reframes the power imbalance as opportunity. Edward offers safety, stability, transformation. Vivian offers emotional awakening, authenticity, feeling. A trade, not a rescue. At least, that's how it's presented. But presentation is everything, isn't it? Edward Lewis. Savior or symptom? Edward is often remembered as the fantasy. Not just the rich man, but the sensitive rich man. The one who learns. The one who changes. The one who chooses connection over conquest. Yet the film never fully interrogates how Edward made his money. He doesn't build companies. He dismantles them. He identifies struggling businesses, strips them for parts, sells what's valuable, and discards the rest. Jobs disappear. Communities fracture. He never sees the aftermath. He doesn't have to. The film treats this as morally neutral, until Vivian reacts. Her discomfort becomes the audience's permission to question Edward. Her emotional response substitutes for ethical debate. Isn't that convenient? Rather than confronting systemic harm, the story personalizes morality. Edward isn't bad because his business model destroys lives. He's troubled because he feels empty. Redemption doesn't require reparations, just romance. Is that a flaw in the story, or a mirror of the culture that embraced it? Kit, the ending that never was. Kit, Vivian's roommate and closest ally, exists on the margins of the fairy tale, but she may be the most honest character in the film. She knows how this world works. She understands the risks. She doesn't romanticize survival. And in the original ending, she wasn't left behind. In early versions of the story, Vivian chooses Kit. They leave together. Not rescued, not transformed, just intact. A future built on friendship, not fantasy. That ending asked a different question. What if love isn't the escape? What if loyalty is? Audiences rejected it. Why? Because it denied the reward structure Hollywood had trained them to expect. No castle. No prince. No symbolic crossing of class boundaries. Just two women navigating a harsh world together. Too real. Too unresolved. Too honest. So the film rewrote its own values. The fire escape as mythology. The fire escape ending didn't just add romance, it rewired the story's meaning. Edward doesn't arrive in a limousine. He climbs. Awkwardly. Uncomfortably. Visibly out of place. It's meant to signal effort. Vulnerability. Risk. But symbolically, it does something else. It reverses the power dynamic. Just enough. Edward enters Vivian's world on her terms. He doesn't elevate her. He descends himself. The roses replace the contract. The fear of heights replaces fear of intimacy. And the audience exhales. But does that symbolic gesture outweigh everything that came before? Or does it simply soothe us into believing that gestures can correct structures? Why the fantasy was necessary? The reason Pretty Woman endures isn't because it tells the truth. It's because it tells a useful lie. A lie that says, love can cross any divide. Money doesn't corrupt sincerity. Power can be softened by emotion. And transformation is always mutual. These ideas are comforting. They feel just. They promise hope without demanding change. And in 1990, on the edge of recession, corporate excess, and cultural anxiety, that promise mattered. But here's the uncomfortable follow-up. Would the film have survived if it hadn't lied? If Vivian hadn't been rescued? If Edward hadn't changed? If love hadn't conquered consequence? History suggests no. The audience as co-author. Pretty Woman didn't become what it is by accident. Audiences shaped it. Studios adjusted it. Hollywood polished it. The darker story was rejected. The softer version was rewarded. Which raises a final, unsettling thought. If we didn't want the truth then, do we want it now? Or do we still prefer stories where inequality dissolves into romance, where moral compromise is redeemed by affection, and where complex systems are solved by personal choice? Pretty Woman isn't just a movie. It's a negotiation between art and appetite, between honesty and hope, between what stories are and what we need them to be. And maybe that's why we keep returning. Because every time we watch it again, we aren't just revisiting a film. We're asking ourselves the same question, quietly, persistently, and without resolution. If love can't fix everything, why do we keep hoping it will? What made it to the screen wasn't performance. It was survival. What happened when Pretty Woman hit the screen wasn't just a clever casting choice or a glossy marketing plan. It was an imaginative, even urgent decision to let human fragility breathe inside a Hollywood-shaped story. The film's success, its continued presence in culture, its lines and images that refuse to go quietly, comes from choices that look, on paper, ordinary, but in practice tilt the whole movie towards something alive. How do we measure what people actually respond to in a film? Is it the jokes, the wardrobe, the plot? Or is it something quieter? A moment when an actor stops pretending and simply endures. Pretty Woman rests on many small endurance tests. Vivian's laugh, Edward's hesitations, Barney's steady gaze. Each of those is a tiny survival. They are actors choosing not to perform a fantasy, but to survive one. Why does that matter? Because survival asks us to root for someone in a way spectacle never can. Spectacle invites applause. Survival invites companionship. Which would you rather give? The tone was set in a single, ordinary second. Think about the scene where Vivian first steps into a world of suits and marble and restrained manners. The camera doesn't need fireworks. It simply lingers on a woman who has decided, for a moment, to walk as if she belongs. The film trusts that this small act, walking differently, lifting her chin, wearing a dress she bought in a moment of bravery, carries dramatic weight. That moment sets the tone for the rest of the film. A series of choices that look small but ripple outward. It's easy to misread that economy as simplicity. The truth is the opposite. Those quiet beats are hard to create. They require actors and a director who believe the audience will follow a gesture. Garry Marshall and Julia Roberts believed in that gesture. They knew an audience could feel a person rearrange themselves, and in that rearranging find hope. If you watched Pretty Woman only for jokes, you missed the architecture. If you watched it for romance, you might have missed the scaffolding that makes romance credible. The scaffolding in this case is survival, the film's emotional blueprint. Barney, the man who was never supposed to be kind. On paper, Barney Thompson is a stock character. The manager, the law, the person who points out doors and closes them. In most scripts, a hotel manager exists to be an obstacle or to deliver a punchline. He's a function, not a person. But Hector Elizondo turned Barney into something else. A witness. He studies people with a particular kind of attention that feels like kindness because it is both steady and deliberate. When Barney looks at Vivian, he doesn't merely see a problem or a threat. He imagines a life and treats her as if she could claim it. That choice, casting Elizondo and allowing him space, reshuffled the film's moral deck. Barney's kindness isn't sentimental. It's pragmatic and human. He offers dignity before the script demands it, and that early respect changes the audience's terms for the story. When someone like Barney is present, redemption feels less like a miracle and more like a possibility that decent people can enable. What does this say about the film's politics? It's not pro-rich, strictly speaking. It's pro-dignity. Barney is the proof that small acts of decency build the narrative bridge between Vivian's world and Edward's. He's the pivot. Without him, the fairy tale frays at the edges. Ask yourself, who are the people in your life who act like Barney, who see you before anyone else does? The song became a second story. Roy Orbison's "Oh, Pretty Woman" wasn't composed for the movie. The song existed with its own history. Longing, observation, a singer watching someone pass. But the film recast the song's meaning. In the movie, the guitar riff is a footfall. The lyric becomes narrative propulsion. That opening riff is not background music. It's a character cue. It clears the stage in the same breath that Vivian's step fills it. When Orbison's voice arrives, it's not commentary, it's confirmation. For many viewers, the song and Julia Roberts' entrance became inseparable. The music told us how to read the image, and the image told us how to hear the music. Why does that matter? Because films that fuse music and image create cultural memory. Think of the next time you hear that riff. You don't just remember a hook, you remember Vivian's grin. That fusion deepens the film's emotional footprint. The song stopped being a popular track and became a cinematic instrument that played the film's theme. Would the film be the same without that musical marriage? Probably not. But the film didn't just pick a song. It picked the right way to use a song, so that sound and movement reinforce each other until separation feels like betrayal. The poster lied, and no one cared. Marketing can be an art of deception. The iconic Pretty Woman poster, Julia Roberts' face, another actress body, a digitally darkened Richard Gere, was not an honest portrait of what the movie contained. The image was calibrated to sell a fantasy faster than the film could build it. Why did that matter so little? Because the promise in the poster was emotional rather than literal. Viewers were buying the suggestion of a particular story. An improbable romance, reimagined elegance, a girl stepping into a different life. The poster delivered that promise with cinematic shorthand. It didn't need to be literal. That willingness to bend photographic truth tells us something about audience priorities. People wanted to buy into a story rather than be shown its literal parts. Posters sell feelings more than facts. Should marketing always be allowed to stretch the truth? No. But in this case, the lie was about style, not substance. The film itself delivered the emotional honesty the poster suggested. So the friction between image and reality wasn't a betrayal. It was a compromise, one that ultimately turned out to be harmless. Kit, the small, loud truth. Kit, Vivian's roommate, could have been a mere trope, the spunky friend who says outrageous things and then disappears. Instead, Laura San Giacomo turned Kit into a moral anchor. Kit's lines puncture the fantasy with a voice that knows both the rules and the cost of breaking them. She's the character who understands survival in a straightforward way. You barter, you negotiate, you harden. And in that knowing, she becomes the film's conscience. Every time Kit appears, she announces the practical realities beyond the fairy tale. She reminds the audience that Vivian's choices have consequences not just for romance but for survival. Kit's humor is a shield, but it's also a lamp that reveals what lies beneath. Why do minor characters sometimes leave the deepest marks? Because they speak truths protagonists cannot, or will not, voice. Kit does that. She calls the film back from flight to ground, and in doing so gives the fantasy texture. Her presence asks the audience important questions. What are we willing to forgive for love? What do we owe those who share a roof with us? Julia Roberts, the star that the film made, and the audience confirmed. Actors get lucky, roles get earned. Julia Roberts had promise before Pretty Woman, but the movie turned that promise into an axis. Vivian is a role that demanded a rare mixture. Comic timing, blunt vulnerability, ferocious animal magnetism, and the courage to be unpolished on purpose. Roberts didn't create Vivian by polishing her. She created Vivian by allowing the character to be rough at the edges. The result felt honest because it was messy. Audiences didn't merely like Vivian, they identified with her. That identification is a form of ownership. Viewers felt they had met someone who could be a friend. Stardom is not the same as celebrity. Celebrity is being recognized. Stardom is being necessary. After Pretty Woman, scripts began to carry the question, what if Julia Roberts? That question reoriented casting and storytelling for a decade. Why did Hollywood respond so quickly? Because studios saw what audiences already knew. Roberts made vulnerability marketable. They saw that people wanted a heroine who could be lovable and complicated at once. The industry tried to bottle that lightning, sometimes successfully, often not. Chemistry that reads as truth. The relationship between Vivian and Edward has been attacked and defended in equal measure. Critics pointed fingers at the film's power dynamics or glossed over its politics. But even critics who disliked the movie often conceded one thing. Roberts and Richard Gere had undeniable chemistry. Chemistry isn't a manufactured commodity. It's a kind of accidental currency that two people generate together. It can't be faked on call. The actors don't have to do more than let the moments below the script bubble up. Awkward pauses, glances that refuse to meet each other, a laugh that arrives a beat too late. That unpredictable human currency is what makes the film feel alive. The chemistry explains why audiences rewound scenes on VHS and why the film's moments survive in GIFs and memory. Is chemistry something producers should try to engineer? They'll try, of course. Casting directors pair names and hope. But chemistry is less about calculation and more about permission. Permission for scenes to breathe, for actors to fail, for something raw to sneak through a scripted arc. Runaway Bride. Sequel by demand. Hollywood is a creature that feeds on successful formulas. The chemistry between Roberts and Gere prompted another pairing in Runaway Bride. Where Pretty Woman felt like a spontaneously lit bonfire, Runaway Bride was more of an attempt to replicate the warmth with a slightly different spark. The sequelish project didn't follow the same script in tone or structure, but the audience appetite was clear. People wanted to see those two together again. Gere's demand, Julia or nothing, reveals a peculiar industry truth. Sometimes an actor will only commit if a partner returns. That's less ego and more an acknowledgement of the intangible. There was something in the first pairing that mattered. The second film did well financially, which proves the audience's appetite was not exhausted. But financially successful films are not always artistically superior. Still, the public's response confirmed a thesis critics sometimes forget. Audiences don't always evaluate film on the same axis as reviewers. They evaluate felt experience. The movie that almost wasn't. 3000. Here's the part of the story that makes the eventual film feel miraculous. Pretty Woman did not begin as a saccharine fairy tale. Its earliest drafts were titled 3000, a mercenary label referencing money and transaction. In those versions, the story was darker. Vivian was more of a cautionary figure, Edward was colder, and the ending was bleak. Early drafts ended with humiliation rather than rescue. In some horrifying versions, Vivian didn't survive. That's more than a tonal shift. It's an entirely different moral universe. That initial script was a cautionary, perhaps punitive narrative about the cost of a world where money and intimacy intersect without mercy. Then Touchstone Pictures, Disney's imprint for adult fare, intervened. The company demanded changes. They softened edges, moved stakes, injected humor. The rewriting process, 6 substantial rewrites, turned a bleak morality play into a story that allowed hope and transformation. Why does this revision matter? Because it shows that Pretty Woman's final form was not inevitable. It was the result of choices, to humanize rather than punish, to find humor instead of nihilism, to trust that characters could change. Those choices were not trivial. They altered the film's ethical architecture. What would culture look like if the original had been filmed? We can imagine a very different legacy. A film that confirmed rock-bottom expectations rather than offering the possibility of change. The version that made it to screens chose a different message. Even in a transactional world, people can surprise themselves. Why the hopeful version endured. There are films that deserve their fate for virtuosity. There are films that deserve their fate for timeliness. Pretty Woman endures because it chose a certain moral economy. Hope over realism. Not hope as a cheap remedy, but hope as a dramatic strategy. The movie makes an argument. Fairy tales are useful as models for possible change. That argument is not naive. Pretty Woman never suggests the world is fair. It suggests that acts of decency, however small, can be catalytic. It suggests that letting people keep their dignity, Barney's steady hand, Kit's truthful crack, Vivian's own stubbornness, makes real-world transformation less like magic and more like work. Is that always true? Of course not. Hope is not a policy. But as a filmic device, hope allows the audience to rehearse the possibility of change. And the practice of rehearsing change matters culturally. Small characters, big scaffolding. Think again about supporting characters who do heavy lifting without fanfare. The hairdresser, the club owner, the chauffeur, each one is a small choice that gives the world texture. These characters anchor the film in a social reality. They make the fairy tale plausible. Why does casting matter so much for these parts? Because the audience must accept the world the film constructs. If the bit players feel like props, the fantasy collapses. But when a character like Barney is fully inhabited, the film's emotional scaffolding is secure. What would the movie be without these details? It would be flatter. The little choices are the mortar that holds the narrative bricks together. They make the film feel lived in, not staged. The harder questions the film asks quietly. Pretty Woman is often criticized for romanticizing inequality, for making a wealthy man's rescue of a poor woman look desirable. Those critiques are valid and worth discussing. But there are subtler questions the film slips into the audience's hands. What does dignity cost? Who gets to grant it? Can someone accept help without losing agency? Can kindness be transactional? Is love a ransom or an offering? The film doesn't answer these fully because it needn't. Its job is to invite the questions, to make viewers sit with them long enough that they take the story beyond a single viewing. That's why the movie survives. It doesn't hand back clean answers. It hands back a set of questions you carry. The mise-en-scene of contradiction. Pretty Woman is full of contradictions deliberately placed in the visual design. Luxury rooms with cheap curtains. Well-cut suits paired with uncertain glances. Costume choices that reveal more about inner life than dialogue ever could. These contradictions produce dramatic friction. Consider how clothing is used. Vivian's outfit transitions are less about fashion than about armor. The clothes are a practical experiment in identity. The film stages clothing as a language. Sometimes lies, sometimes truth, always negotiation. Isn't that precisely how people use clothes in real life? We dress to belong. We dress to be seen. The film recognizes this instinct and uses it to create small theatrical reveals. Clothing becomes another actor. Why we keep returning. Repetition as ritual. Nearly 35 years on, people still watch Pretty Woman because ritualized viewing produces comfort. The film has become shorthand for a kind of cinematic consolation. It's a movie people revisit when they want the particular sort of reassurance that emerges from a story where someone is seen and then respected. But ritual doesn't explain everything. The film's endurance is not only comfort-seeking. It's also that the movie offers a template. A person can step into another life and, through acts of courage, small kindnesses, and unlikely alliances, reconfigure it. That template continues to matter. When audiences return, are they naive? Or are they practicing optimism? Perhaps both. People return because the film offers both aesthetic pleasure and an emotional rehearsal in how to be human to another human. The cost of choosing hope. Choosing hope in storytelling isn't free of risk. Pretty Woman could have been called sentimental or manipulative. The film risks being accused of smoothing over real-world pain. But choosing hope was a deliberate gamble. The filmmakers believed beauty could coexist with grit. That gamble paid off because the movie balanced hope with a moral seriousness. It didn't pretend the world was cured. It simply insisted that dignity and kindness could be parts of the plot, not mere afterthoughts. What responsibility does a filmmaker have when choosing hope? Is it to the truth, or to the possibility? The best answer is both. Films are both mirrors and beacons. Pretty Woman understood this. It chose to reflect hardship while also acting as a beacon, one that suggested the possibility of change without erasing consequence. The film's afterlife. Critics, audiences, and cultural memory. Critical reception and popular response often diverge. Pretty Woman is a perfect example. Critics parsed its power imbalances. Audiences embraced its emotional logic. Over time, culture tends to synthesize these perspectives. The film's afterlife is a conversation between critique and affection. That conversation is healthy. It allows us to revisit the film not as frozen artifact but as evolving dialogue. We can criticize without canceling, adore without ignoring problems. That dialectic is part of the film's continuing relevance. Why does this afterlife matter? Because the films that endure are those that invite reinterpretation. They don't answer questions once and for all. They become sites where new viewers project contemporary concerns and old viewers test memory against present realities. Final act. Why the choice to humanize mattered. Pretty Woman's survival in the cultural memory is not the result of marketing alone, nor the result of a single performance. It's the product of multiple small choices. Casting actors who could make survival feel like an active verb, a director who trusted silence, musicians whose notes doubled as narrative, and producers who, eventually, opted for humanization over punishment. The move from 300 to Pretty Woman is not merely a title change. It's a moral pivot. It's the decision to let characters live rather than expire as cautionary symbols. That pivot created a space where a fairy tale could feel earned because it had been built from small, believable acts. Why does that matter to us now? Because stories are experiments in empathy. When a film trusts its audience enough to let quiet dignity matter, it asks us to be better. It asks us to imagine a world where people like Barney exist, where Kit's truth-telling is heard, where Vivian can survive and then, maybe, thrive. Is that world realistic? Not always. Is it necessary? Sometimes. Films that do not offer hope risk being accurate and toothless. Films that do offer hope risk being sentimental. Pretty Woman manages both risks because it grounds its hope in survival. A stubborn, practical thing that asks only to be seen. What, then, do we take from it? Maybe this, that the smallest acts of recognition, someone looking at you and deciding you belong, can change the arc of a life. That is the film's real miracle. Not the millionaire's car or the glittering nights. The miracle is in being noticed. And at the end of the day, isn't that what most of us are looking for?